And we are back for prepping for winter with the second Tyrion sample chapter. Where were we? Oh right, Tyrion is in the middle of the Battle of Fire, dreading the coming carnage, very much unlike Victarion and Barristan. The battle is heavily paralleled to both the Battle of the Green Fork and the Battle of the Blackwater, and Tyrion finds himself thinking of the past women of his life, Tysha and Shae. Meanwhile, the current woman of his life, Penny, is dressing him for battle. And so let's continue. Penny kissed him. She moved so fast that he had no time to think. She darted in, quick as a bird, and pressed her lips to his. Just as quickly, it was over. What was that for? He almost said, but he knew what it was for. Thank you, he might have said, but she might take that as leave to do it again. Child, I have no wish to hurt you. He could have tried, but Penny was no child, and his wishes would not blunt the cut. For the first time for longer than he cared to think, Tyrion Lannister was at a loss for words. So here Penny kisses Tyrion, for some reason, and Tyrion is at a loss of words for longer than he cared to think. That final line is quite interesting, as we actually know when his last loss of words was. It was at the Wall, back in A Game of Thrones, when Maester Aemon calls him a giant. This is the line. For once, Tyrion Lannister found himself at a loss of words. He could only bow his head politely and say, "You are too kind, Maester Aemon." So as it turns out, Shae was not the first person to call Tyrion a giant. Maester Aemon was, and Shae really only calls Tyrion a giant because Tyrion mentions the term first. While Tyrion seems to think his issues and trauma begin with Shae, we know it goes back further, to his insecurity about being a dwarf and his relationship with his father. Whatever the case, Penny has chosen to kiss Tyrion, which we should be suspicious of. We have no reason to trust Penny, and her backstory is filled with contradictions. And we don't really know why she has even tagged along with Tyrion and Jorah. None of it makes much sense. Not to mention, she has been paralleled in this chapter a bit with Shae, another untrustworthy character, though then again, she is also paralleled with Tysha, a character who should have been trusted but wasn't. So who knows what kind of character Penny is. Still, we see no reason why Penny should be kissing Tyrion. She does blame Tyrion for the death of her brother, and Tyrion has brought her nothing but peril, and he hasn't even been particularly nice to her. And Tyrion is not a good-looking man, even for a dwarf, and less so after losing his nose. There doesn't seem to be any reason why Penny would be pursuing romance with Tyrion. She looks so young, he thought. A girl, that's all she is. A girl. And almost pretty if you can forget she's a dwarf. Her hair was warm brown, thick and curly, and her eyes were large and trusting. Too trusting. And so here we get the feeling that Tyrion is placing Penny in the same category as the other women of his life, the innocent girl who needs saving, just like Shae, just like Sansa, just like Tysha. And regarding this, there is perhaps a callback to Tysha with the mention of Penny's warm brown hair. Tysha used to sing "The Seasons of My Love," which is a song that describes the beauty of women's hair for each season and time of day. Now, regarding Penny's perceived innocence, I will say there's a bit of ambiguity with that last line. Her eyes were large and trusting. Too trusting. Does Tyrion mean that Penny is too trusting of the world for her own good, that is, too naive? Or does he mean that she comes off as trusting and naive, but it's a little too naive to be believed? We are about to be presented elements from both interpretations. First, Tyrion tries to scare Penny, as if she's too trusting for her own good. Then Tyrion compares Penny to Shae and nearly kills her, as if she's too innocent to be believed. So first, here's the scaring. "Do you hear that sound?" said Tyrion. She listened. "What is it?" she said as she was strapping a pair of mismatched greaves onto his stunted legs. "War. On either side of us and not a league away. That's slaughter, Penny. That's men stumbling through the mud with their entrails hanging out. That's severed limbs and broken bones and pools of blood. You know how the worms come out after a hard rain? I hear they do the same after a big battle if enough blood soaks into the ground. That's the stranger coming, Penny. The black goat, the pale child. Him of many faces, call him what you will. That's death." And so here Tyrion goes into trying to frighten Penny, giving credence to the idea that Tyrion really believes that Penny is an innocent, overly trusting character. I will say this little speech is kind of repetitive, as earlier in the chapter, Tyrion had already told Penny there was bloody fighting going on either side of them, and a league off. Though this time it's slightly more gruesome and poetic. And again, I should point out that a league, that is 3 miles, is too far of a distance for the battle to be at. George R.R. Martin is horrible at distances, but at least this time it's not a league away instead of a good league away, so it's slightly shorter. As I've said before, this speech to scare Penny does mirror Barristan's speech in his sample chapter, with Barristan's being an attempt to give courage to his men. This speech tries to do the exact opposite with a horrible description of war, void of any glory. And as I've said before, the stranger coming is Barristan himself, who prayed to the stranger before the battle, and who rides a pale mare, like death in the Book of Revelation. Now various gods are mentioned in the speech: the black goat of Qohor, the pale child Bacalon, and him of many faces. Of course, we know the most of him of many faces, the deity that the faceless men worship in Braavos. The black goat we know mostly as the god that Vargo Hoat worships, though he is mentioned here and there throughout the story, mainly as a proxy for him of many faces. The pale child actually comes from a couple of different non-Ice and Fire George R. R. Martin stories. Bacalon is mentioned in the 1976 story, The Lonely Song of Lauren Dor, as a devil-like character who will feed on the protagonist, and in the 1975 story, And 7 Times Never Kill Man, as a godlike being worshipped by a group of militaristic settlers called the Steel Angels. Here in Ice and Fire, Bacalon has retained this aspect, being a god of soldiers. Curiously, in the previous 5 Ice and Fire books, Bacalon has been mentioned only once, and now he has 2 mentions in the sample chapters, the other being in the Forsaken chapter as one of the gods killed by Euron in Aeron's vision. You're scaring me. Am I? Good. You should be scared. We have Ironborn swarming ashore and Sir Barristan and his Unsullied pouring out the city gates, with us between them, fighting on the wrong bloody side. I'm terrified myself. You say that, but you still make japes. Japes are one way to keep the fear away. Wine's another. So here Tyrion again tells us of their physical position, somewhere between the Ironborn coming ashore and the Unsullied. Of course, he can't actually be directly between them, as we know that the Trebuchet Harridan is the closest to the gates of Meereen, not Wicked Sister where Tyrion is located. But Tyrion is apparently trying to scare Penny, so some liberties are taken, it seems. It is interesting that Tyrion says that the Unsullied are still pouring out the gates. Earlier in the chapter, Tyrion lamented the failed opportunity for the Yunkish to smash the Unsullied before they could form up, as if it happened in the past. Perhaps the front of the Unsullied are in a shield wall and the rear of the Unsullied are still coming out? Tyrion then mentions that japes and wine are good ways to keep fear away. This does help explain some of Tyrion's behavior in the first sample chapter when he was joking around and trying to manipulate the Second Sons into changing sides. Much of the perceived confidence in that chapter could have been feigned, or it may be that Tyrion was actually scared and covering it all up with jokes. Now again, what's different about this battle is that Tyrion wants a drink. Tyrion normally doesn't drink before battle, and is notably angry at Oberyn Martell for doing so. Regarding that, it is interesting to imagine that Oberyn was actually drinking before his battle because he was scared. That would be something completely alien to his character. You're brave. Little people can be brave. My Giant of Lannister, he heard. She is mocking me. He almost slapped her again. His head was pounding. I never meant to make you angry, Penny said. Forgive me. I'm frightened is all. She touched his hand. Tyrion wrenched away from her. I'm frightened. Those were the same words Shay had used. Her eyes were as big as eggs, and I swallowed every bit of it. I knew what she was. I told Bronn to find a woman for me, and he brought me Shay. His hands curled into fists, and Shay's face swam before him, grinning. Then the chain was tightening about her throat, the golden hands digging deep into her flesh, as her own hands fluttered against his face with all the force of butterflies. If he'd had a chain to hand, if he'd had a crossbow, a dagger, anything, he would have, he might have, And so here we have a dark and rather violent turn for Tyrion. Earlier, Tyrion thought Penny was too trusting for her own good, and thus he was trying to scare her to give her a healthy fear for her own self-preservation. But now things have changed. It's too trusting to be believed. Tyrion compares Penny very directly and a bit delusionally to Shay. After all, little people can be brave is a pretty far cry from my Giant of Lannister, yet that is what Tyrion hears. My Giant of Lannister is, by the way, Shay's final words before Tyrion kills her. After this, Tyrion thinks that she is mocking him, but we don't know which she it is, Penny or Shay. Now, it is true that Shay did say, "I'm frightened," but the whole phrase was, "Wake up, my lord, I'm frightened," making the parallel to "Forgive me, I'm frightened" is all a bit of a leap in Tyrion's mind. Additionally, the "I'm frightened" moment is actually the moment that Tyrion woke up before the Battle of the Green Fork. This actually highlights the fact that Shay did not tremble in Tyrion's arms as a frightened child as he imagined. Tyrion is definitely going a bit nuts and conflating and misremembering events. So it's not just words that make Tyrion connect Penny to Shay, but it also seems to be their eyes. Earlier, Tyrion noted that Penny had large eyes, and here he notes that Shay had large eyes, and he sees these eyes as a vulnerability for him. Again, these are rather large jumps in Tyrion's crazy mind. And then Tyrion starts hallucinating and actually sees Shay in front of him. This is a bit similar to when Jon hallucinated at the wall and saw Lady Catelyn's face in front of him in A Storm of Swords right before the election. Jon, like Tyrion, was also acting unusually aggressive. And here Tyrion really succumbs to the hallucination, imagining himself choking Shay. He imagines her hands up against his face like butterfly wings. In A Storm of Swords, by the way, he describes her hands wiping away his tears. And it does seem that Tyrion is on the verge of killing whatever figure is in front of him, who he thinks is Shay. But of course, the figure in front of him is actually Penny. And we definitely get a sense of how jumbled Tyrion's memories and rage are. Here he goes straight from his murder of Shay with the chain, to the crossbow, the tool he used to murder his father over Tysha. Then it goes to a dagger, perhaps connecting it to the weapon that Penny tried to kill Tyrion with. It's all rather lucky that Penny and Tyrion are interrupted, as Penny seems rather close to death in this scene. It was only then that Tyrion heard the shouts. He was lost in a black rage, drowning in a sea of memory, but the shouting brought the world back in a rush. He opened his hands, took a breath, turned away from Penny. Something's happening. He went outside to discover what it was. Dragons. So here we have a very interesting passage that perhaps has some significant implications. Tyrion had been experiencing an unusual amount of rage and experiencing hallucinations. And as I said, this is somewhat like when Jon experienced unusual rage and hallucinations in A Storm of Swords. But then, significantly, Tyrion discovers that a dragon is near. Now, if you recall, back when Jon had his episode, he eventually deduced why he was feeling the way he was feeling. It was because Ghost was nearby. The persona of the wolf was blending and influencing Jon's persona. It doesn't fully explain the hallucinations, but it explains the emotional instability and rage. And I do wonder if Tyrion is experiencing something similar with the presence of a dragon nearby. Now yes, there are all sorts of theories about Tyrion's parentage, but one doesn't need to go into all of that. We just have to remember that Tyrion is peculiar in that he has dragon dreams. He used to dream of them as a child and stare into flames for hours, imagining the burning of his family. Of course, Jon has wolf dreams and is clearly affected by the mind of a direwolf when it's in the vicinity. It may be that the same thing is going on with Tyrion and dragons. It all would make the scenes mirror each other. There's Jon, who dreams of wolves, feeling rage and hallucinations, Catelyn's face in front of him, before the reveal that it's the effects of a nearby direwolf. And there's Tyrion, who dreams of dragons, feeling rage and hallucinations, Shay's face in front of him, before the reveal that it's the effects of a dragon nearby. It's all tough to say, but it would help square why Tyrion is absolutely off his rocker in this scene. Yes, he may just fear the upcoming battle, but it's rather extreme that Tyrion hallucinates and nearly murders Penny based on some comments that very loosely sound like Shay. It does seem like someone or something is messing with Tyrion's head. Now, alternatively, it may not be the dragon, but instead Tyrion's sobriety that's causing the problem. We know at the start of A Dance with Dragons, Tyrion is drinking to stop his dreams. In this scene, Tyrion is notably sober, thus if there is a mental manipulator out there, they may have an easier time getting to him. The green beast was circling above the bay, banking and turning as long ships and galleys clashed and burned below him. But it was the white dragon the sellswords were gawking at. 300 yards away, the Wicked Sister swung her arm. Chunk thump. and 6 fresh corpses went dancing through the sky. Up they rose, and up and up. Then 2 burst into flame. The dragon caught one burning body just as it began to fall, crunching it between his jaws as pale fires ran across his teeth. White wings cracked against the morning air, and the beast began to climb again. The second corpse caromed off an outstretched claw and plunged straight down, to land amongst some Yunkish horsemen. One horse reared up and threw his rider. The others ran, trying to outrace the flames and fanning them instead. Tyrion Lannister could almost taste the panic as it rippled across the camps. So here we hear about the current position of our 2 dragons, Rhaegal and Viserion. Viserion is now flying near Tyrion and Wicked Sister, while Rhaegal is out on the bay circling the clashing and burning ships. And it's of note that the ships are burning. Now, perhaps Rhaegal is simply curious or attracted to the noise of the ships, but one very important thing to remember is that the Ironborn holds are filled with pork. Victarion had stopped at the Isle of Cedars and filled his larders after hunting boar there, and thus, in all likelihood, Rhaegal is attracted to the smell of burning ham from an Ironborn ship aflame. Over with Viserion, we find him catching dead bodies from Wicked Sister and eating them. Again, we find that the trebuchet is now firing multiple bodies, that is, heavier loads, 6 bodies instead of 1. And I will say, 6 bodies is a massive amount of weight. Ice and fire catapults and trebuchets are much larger than any from our history. In A Clash of Kings, the catapults at the Blackwater fired human bodies much further than their regular projectiles, which means they're designed for perhaps 300-pound loads. And these trebuchets are firing 6 bodies at a time, something like a 1,000-pound load. That's nearly triple anything from the Middle Ages. But this switch to a heavier load is significant, as a heavier load means a shorter firing range, onto the battlefield instead of into the city of Meereen. Now, calculating a trebuchet's firing distance is actually pretty complicated, but in a very, very general sense, if you increase the weight of a projectile by 600%, you're going to get a reduction in distance of, well, a lot, maybe 80%. That's a guess. There are hundreds of factors that could make that statement completely wrong. And that's kind of the point. I can't do the trebuchet calculation, George R.R. Martin can't do the calculation, and the characters in the story can't do the calculation. The easiest way to figure out where things will fall is through trial and error, which the Yunkish seem to be doing. But we can confidently say that the projectiles will fall well short of their original location of just inside the walls of Meereen, and instead straight onto the battlefield. Now, it may seem odd that Viserion is choosing to feed on dead bodies rather than all of the living people and horses that are out on the battlefield, and this may have something to do with how the dragons were fed. Rhaegal and Viserion were kept beneath the pyramid where dead animals were tossed to them. Here again, dead animals, people, are being tossed through the sky. Viserion may perceive this as a regular feeding. Now, the final line of the passage is interesting. Tyrion can almost taste the panic. Of course, panic is fear, something that many predators can smell, and smell and taste are highly linked. We know that the Starks have heightened senses around their direwolves, so I do wonder if Tyrion has heightened senses as well with a dragon near. The sharp, familiar scent of urine filled the air. The dwarf glanced about and was relieved to see that it was Inkpots who had pissed himself, not him. "You had best go change your breeches," Tyrion told him, "and whilst you're at it, turn your cloak." The paymaster blanched, but did not move. And so here Inkpots, Tyrion's direct superior, pisses himself. And adding to the idea that Tyrion has a heightened sense of smell, Tyrion smells Inkpot's urine, sharply no less. Now this is a bit unusual. Smelling fresh urine outdoors in a camp that probably already stinks is unlikely. Perhaps this is nothing more than a gag, but coupled with Tyrion tasting panic and nearly killing Penny in a blind fury, Tyrion's heightened sense of smell is a bit noteworthy. And Tyrion then tells Inkpots to turn his cloak, which is an important development. Later, Inkpots will have a bit of influence over the fate of the Second Sons. And this is a good place to stop. We will continue on in Tyrion 2, Part 5. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.